Right, good afternoon and welcome to the second webinar in the Legal Leadership series, Leading in a Volatile, Uncertain, Complex and Ambiguous World, presented by Suze Wilson and hosted by myself, Alex Wakelin of LexisNexis. Today's webinar will introduce participants to some of the newer ideas around leadership which have relevance to the modern legal business environment and provide some practical models and strategies for individuals making decisions in uncertain times. Just before we launch into it, a couple of housekeeping matters. You'll note that the webinar is recorded. The recording will be made available to attendees after the event, along with copies of the slides for your records and recognition of your attendance for CPD purposes. A reminder to turn off all mobile phones or turn to flight mode to avoid interference with your audio experience. If you've got questions you'd like to ask during the webinar, and you are invited to do so, please use the chat function on the right-hand side of the page. It may be located somewhere else on your page if you're accessing via your smartphone or iPad. You can submit questions at any point during the presentation, and Suze will address them as they arise. Please send the questions to myself, the host. And finally, there's a survey that pops up at the end of the webinar. We'd be very grateful if you'd complete it and return it to assist us with our efforts to continually improve our events. And now to introduce you to today's presenter. Dr. Suze Wilson is a senior lecturer and leadership scholar at Massey University. Her research challenges heroic notions of leadership, while her teaching is focused on equipping emerging or established leaders to practice leadership in ways better geared to 21st century realities of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Prior to taking up her academic career, Suze held various senior roles in organisations such as the State Services Commission, New Zealand Post, MPI and the Ministry of Education, and consulted to a diverse range of organisations on people and strategy related issues. Dr. Wilson also works as an executive coach. I'm very much looking forward to this presentation today, and thank you, Suze, and over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to meet you, if only virtually. Leadership is a topic that I've never yet met somebody who thinks it's boring. So hopefully I'll be able to add to the prior knowledge that you already have of this, because everyone knows something about leadership, and particularly introduce you to some ideas that aren't really making it into the airport bookshop kind of style of leadership textbook, but nonetheless are provoking a lot of debate in the research area. And I know that, you know, from working with students around these ideas, they find them a pretty fascinating way to think a little bit differently about leadership, and particularly to try and grapple with the kinds of challenges that our contemporary environment throws up at us. So the idea that we live in volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous times won't be news to any of us. It's what we actually do encounter every time we open a news website. And the kinds of key drivers of that won't be a surprise to anyone either. So the disruptive effects of globalisation and new technology, the way values are shifting and behaviours follow along. Our populations are much more diverse than in previous decades. And we live in an environment where people are increasingly uncertain as to what constitutes the truth and what constitutes fake news. So notions of authority, which of course traditionally has sat very close to leadership, are being questioned and doubted in a way that is really quite unprecedented. And so in that sense, if you like, the older style of leadership where the leader knows best, or at least is believed that the leader knows best, is no longer a certainty in the modern environment. So the idea that in some sense that we can direct from positions of a hierarchy what will happen and that people will simply go along with those instructions is no longer as true as it once was. And that means that we have to think about, well, how do we lead then in different ways if we cannot rely simply on the exercise of authority, if we cannot assume that we will secure compliance from followers? What is it that might help us lead, and what is it that might help us navigate in the context of these kinds of disruptive changes and still allow us to gain some sense of forward momentum rather than just being awash in a sea of competing pressures? So in response to these kinds of concerns, what's been growing of growing interest to researchers over the last sort of 10 to 15 years is essentially this idea of post-heroic leadership. So accepting, in some sense, that leaders cannot, in the complex environment in which we now live, cannot have all the answers, and they cannot dictate a resolution of shared challenges. So what does that then mean? It means we have to think about leadership in different ways. These scholars have also put quite a lot of effort into recognising that when we put leaders on a pedestal, and think of them as the heroes who are here to save us, there are actually some problematic consequences that start to arise. One thing is that leaders might start to believe that they indeed do know best, which then incites hubris. And there's some researchers in the UK now that are researching the notion of hubris as an acquired personality disorder, something that comes as a potentially, if you like, polluting impact of being in power. But also what happens when we set leaders up on the pedestal as those who know best, those who know the answers, is that we actually encourage everyone else to become in a position of dependency on leaders. And given the kinds of challenges that we face in organisations and society, we actually need everyone to lean into trying to address things, not just the few. And so this dependency dynamic also isn't helpful. So post-heroic scholars start to shift our thinking, really. So rather than thinking about leadership as just what the leader does or who the leader is, which we could call leader-ship, so just focused on leaders. Instead, we think about leading and following. We think about context and all of those things together constituting leadership. So it shifts us to a broader way of thinking. It shifts us to understanding leadership as a relationship, something that happens between leaders and followers and what they produce together. And rather, therefore, being something that emerges from the leader, it emerges from the interaction between leaders and followers, grappling with issues in their context, and there's this essentially an unfolding practice. So this way of thinking helps us move beyond just a focus on leaders alone and not just thinking about the role, the formal role that a leader might hold, but rather what's the interaction between those who are leading, those who are following, and their context. So all of the ideas that I'm going to introduce you to today really kind of come from this basic paradigm of thinking about leadership in a different, more inclusive fashion. So the first one I want to explore is some work by the British scholar Keith Grint. And he's essentially suggesting that we need to understand that there are different modes of action which are suited for different needs. So the mode of command is, in a sense, where we are directive. We tell people this is what you need to do, this is how you're going to do it, this is when you're going to do it, essentially issuing orders or instructions, providing the answers. This mode of action is suitable in Grint's account for dealing with critical or urgent problems. Okay? So if there were a fire alarm goes off, for example, it would be perfectly appropriate to move into command mode and to issue an instruction. Okay? But for most of the time, the nature of the problems and challenges that we are dealing with in organisations and society do not require and are not best served by people moving into command mode. The mode of management is really around trying to organise things in an orderly fashion through processes and policies so that we can have consistent practices. Right? And this mode is influenced by evidence, it's influenced by precedent, it's concerned with optimising results, and it's especially suitable for dealing with problems where we can essentially define the nature of the problem and define the nature of the solution. And in that sense, the problem itself is solvable and is what's often called tame. Okay? So management work is suited for that kind of issue. He then contrasts management and command with leadership and suggests a really different take on leadership than has been the conventional understanding. So he's arguing that leadership essentially is the domain of asking questions to try and identify ways of grappling with problems themselves that are not amenable to clear definition and not amenable to tight resolution. They're actually ongoing issues that we're just going to have to get grappling with. So the issue of unstable markets, for example, there isn't a solution to that. There are simply ways of grappling with that. And this mode, this leadership mode, particularly relies on a collaborative mindset and collaborative practices, because what the leader is trying to do is draw in other people's ideas by asking them powerful questions to get them thinking, so that together, through leading and following, through tuning into shared values, we start to find, okay, this is a way of grappling with these kinds of challenges. So you can see that this way of thinking about leadership is quite some distance from the traditional heroic model. And it really rests on the belief that actually because a leader alone cannot know the answer, how they can be useful is by focusing on what are the useful, powerful questions that will really make a difference to trying to make progress on the most difficult of challenges. Now, what I think is important to understand about this framework is that none of these modes is right for every situation. And as someone trying to navigate a range of issues in the workplace, this provides, if you like, a bit of a heuristic model to think about what is the nature of the issue that I'm dealing with, therefore what mode of action should I be prioritising. Now, of course, some problems at different points in their life cycle, you may have to move modes. And so that capacity to be adaptive is also what's implicit to this model, the idea that we can switch gears, if you like, to respond to the nature of the issues. The other thing that I think is embedded in this that's worth drawing your attention to is that how we understand the problem is itself contestable. Right? So people may call something a crisis because it is convenient to them to be able to move into a command mode. And actually, the nature of the issue would be better understood as either a tame problem that requires a managerial response, or in fact a wicked problem that requires leadership. Grint argues, in fact, that we are addicted to command, that this is often where we fall to because it gives us a sense of confidence and control that, well, we'll just do this. And really, in reality, where we have more complex problems, more wicked problems, those simple solutions, while they might, if you like, fool some people some of the time, won't produce sustainable momentum in terms of trying to grapple with them. Now, the additional mode that I wanted to throw into this particular conversation is that of professionalism, given that this seminar is aimed at people who work in the law profession. And as you'll know from your professional training, how you gain credibility with your peers is through having more knowledge, more expertise, and continuing to grow that knowledge and expertise over the course of your career, such that when a client or a colleague has a question, you know the answer. Now, I want to suggest, therefore, that professionalism also sits in a relationship of tension with leadership, because professionalism encourages you to provide the answers, but if you're wanting to engage in leadership, you may have to find a way to be able to set that aside and engage in asking questions, engage in collaboration. So when we put these ideas together in a bit of a visual, we can see that these different modes can be mapped on a continuum horizontally from essentially a coercive way of influencing others, which is command, a more calculative and ration and fact and evidence-based mode of influencing others, which is management. And then leadership is around connecting around feelings and correcting around values. What should we do? So different ways of engaging, and then up the vertical axis, what you see is the different kinds of problems. Are they critical problems? Are they tame problems? Or are they wicked problems? Okay? And as we move up that vertical axis, what we find is greater and greater levels of uncertainty about what is the nature of the problem and how do we solve it. And as we move along the horizontal axis, what we find is greater and greater demand to be able to work collaboratively with others. Okay? So again, this is a simple kind of framework in terms of guiding action, but it helps us think about what is the nature of the issues that we're dealing with, therefore what mode should I move into to try and be of most value. Are there any questions about these ideas so far?
I've got one here, Suze. Are there any recommendations on how to draw on shared values for influence in an increasingly diverse environment where values are not necessarily shared? Is there any research that looks at that at all? Or can you comment on that?
I'm struggling just at the moment to think of research off the top of my head.
Yeah.
It probably needs to come down to find those shared values. Sometimes we might have to dig deeper. So there's that kind of funny song from the 90s about "I bet the Russians love their children too." So it might be that we, yeah. So which was a comment about the Cold War. It may be that we actually have to come to very fundamental human values: the need for respect, the need to be heard, the need to have our culture and our heritage acknowledged as valid, as part of who we are. It might be that we need to come right back to those very, very foundational issues to find that common ground if you're working with an environment that has ended up being very divided. Because those are things that we know that there are universal values shared across all cultures, you know, care for our children, concern for the future, need for respect and so forth. So that would be a suggestion, is come back to those fundamentals and try to, in that sense, create the trust that then allows us to talk about the things that we are divided on without destroying the relationship. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Great question. All right. Shall I keep moving then?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So where Brent sort of lands then in thinking about leadership is this notion that what it involves is persuading the collective to take responsibility for what essentially are shared problems. Okay? It's not about providing the answers. Now, in principle, that sounds reasonably easy, but it starts to help us understand actually, therefore, leadership is going to be a space of tension. So let's just explore a little bit of what those tensions might be. So for a start, this research here from Gallup, which was cited in another book I was reading, suggests that there's a little bit of a gap between what people are looking for from leaders and what they're getting. So there's a need to work on that. And it also suggests that, therefore, we need to remind ourselves that just because somebody's in a management role with leadership responsibilities, it doesn't mean actually that they're engaging in good leadership practice. Far from it, the numbers would suggest. However, if we're interested in the idea about, okay, we're going to try and persuade others to take responsibility for our shared problems, what would that look like? Well, clearly from a, if you like, definitional perspective, persuasion is not commanding, it's not coercing, it's not demanding, directing, instructing, or delegating, or pressurising. That's not what these ideas are about. Implicit in this notion that we are trying to persuade others is the idea that actually followers have got a choice. Okay? We're trying to find some way of connecting with them that they go, yeah, actually I'm on board with that idea. Yeah, I'm willing to offer support to that, rather than just using managerial authority. It's also the case, though, that when we're looking at this persuasion process, it's not just about rhetorical prowess. Okay? We don't really just want to kind of promote leadership as the person who can speak most eloquently in a meeting if they're not going to back that up with a whole bunch of other interaction relational practices. Okay? So again, we're coming back to this notion of how do we help people work through the issues to a point where we can say, okay, so here are the shared values that we've got that we're going to use to inform and guide us on how we deal with these issues, and how do we make sense of what's going on? Okay, what's the narrative, the story that we're going to jointly construct to help us understand what it is that we need to do in these circumstances. Okay? And that process of shared sense-making involves giving space for people to give voice to what's on their mind and listening to that and trying to connect that into some kind of narrative. Okay? But what this idea of persuading others to take responsibility also points to is that we should expect to encounter resistance and reluctance. Okay? Because there are times in life where we are very happy to avoid taking responsibility. Okay? For all sorts of reasons, including simply that we might just feel too busy, or we might not feel confident we've got something to contribute, or we're not even interested in the issue. Okay? But when somebody is trying to engage in leadership, relying on these ideas, they're needing to somehow speak to us in a way that makes us realise, yep, okay, I have to get involved in this. Yep, I have to make a contribution. Yep, it's in my interest to do this, and I've got something to contribute. But what it helps us understand is because we're going to encounter this resistance, because we're going to encounter this reluctance, this is part of the reason that the temptation to move back into command or to move back into management is ever present. It's really hard work doing this persuasion stuff, okay? And it's much easier to issue instructions or to set out processes. And that's why, in some sense, we may be seeing these kinds of numbers that we're seeing of people not feeling that they're being offered inspiration for how to move forward, because it's just easier to move back into command, move back into management, or potentially move into professionalism. So hanging in the space of doing leadership work needs to come with a health warning that it's not easy work, and others will not necessarily welcome their effort with open arms until we've found ways to connect with them. So building on these ideas then, to think about how might we enable an organisation overall to change. Okay, what are the kinds of processes that might be involved in that? And many times the way change is tackled in an organisation is through some kind of project management way of thinking, often around a restructure. Okay? So these ideas that I'm going to introduce you to suggest actually there's a whole different way. And to grapple with them, we first need to grasp the difference between what's complicated and what's complex. So the example here is that an airplane's complicated because it's got lots of discrete parts, even though they interact, but they can be pulled apart and looked at separately. And in contrast, mayonnaise is complex because once it's been turned into mayonnaise, you can't actually pull the ingredients apart again. Right? So there is essentially this rich interconnectivity between the ingredients where we have conditions of complexity. And this way of thinking argues that we have to understand that organisations are way, way more like mayonnaise than they are airplanes. And so the common approach to organisational change where we go, oh, that unit there, we're going to restructure that business function there, we're going to restructure that business process there, we're going to restructure that, isn't really, if you like, the most powerful way to enable change. Instead, this model here, which is from Mary Albeen and Michael Arena, suggests that we should think of leading change as tuning into different modes of enablement. Okay? So the entrepreneurial mode is where we're trying to foster other people to come up with new ideas. Okay? We're looking for initiative, we're looking for people tinkering about, we're looking for people who are identifying new opportunities that the organisation isn't currently enacting. And when we find those entrepreneurial germs, then the role of leadership is to enable them to take root. So link up different ideas, guard those that are fostering the different ideas from those that are trying to squash them, give them space to grow, promote those ideas within the organisation until such time as they have taken enough root. They've proven that they've got sufficient merit that we can then look to, okay, now how do we lock that into our ordinary practice? How do we lock that into essentially our routine way of doing it? And so from this model, which I think builds quite nicely on the earlier one we looked at, again, it's about different modes of work depending on where in the process of change things are at. Do we need to go and elicit ideas? Do we need to support the germination of ideas and allow them to nurture and grow? Or do we need now to embed them within the organisation? So again, this is suggesting a different way of thinking that requires leaders to move and adapt, but also clearly to collaborate with others, because this is definitely not about the leader necessarily having had the idea themselves. This is about tuning into what others are pointing to as possibilities. So, are there any particular questions about that idea? Oops, there's the slide by mistake.
That's all right. I've got one question here. Is it possible to manage up to foster engagement with this notion of post-heroic leadership? Is it something?
Yes, definitely. Yes, yep. Sorry, I just needed to think that. So yes, definitely, because these ways of thinking about leadership are not positional. Okay? They are about what are the behaviours that you're doing, going back to Grant, to persuade others to take responsibility. And so sometimes we may be sitting at a lower rank in the organisation and we are needing to persuade those above us to take responsibility for something that they're not. Often what we may see is actually someone essentially in a lower rank position playing a leadership role, unofficially, informally, trying to influence people higher up who have slipped into command or management or professionalism. And the person is actually trying to elicit them back into the work of leadership, into the work of challenging the complex problems and collaborating around trying to make progress on them. So yes, definitely this can be used upwards as well.
Great, thank you.
All right. So where I want to move to now is some ideas about what might be some useful, if you like, personal underpinnings or personal capabilities that would help someone do the kind of leadership work that we've been talking about. So although these ideas aren't reliant on leaders having the answers, they do nonetheless rely on people who are doing leadership work to develop certain personal attributes to be able to do that work effectively. Okay? So this model here of cognitive complexity is built on some work by Robert Keegan, who is a developmental psychologist. And he looks at, he's particularly interested in how we learn to think better. And his model essentially takes us over the whole of our lives. So when we're little ones, in his model, essentially, he's trying to point to that our understanding of basic reality is really quite limited. You know, we don't really understand that the cars zooming down the street could kill us. Okay? And so when we're just little like this, we need extensive supervision. As we grow, so from about age 7 through to early adulthood, we move beyond that. We move initially to a reasonably self-involved state. So we have awareness of ourselves, but we don't really yet understand how we can impact on others. We don't yet really understand the bigger picture of the world in which we're living on. And we tend to see other people either as people who help us do what we want to do or people who will stop us doing from what we want to do. And so clearly this is developmental, but it's not a great state for an adult to live in. So what Keegan's research suggests is that most adults get to what he calls level 3, level of cognitive complexity. And this is where we are fairly well socialised. We know how to behave ourselves and if you like, follow social norms for polite behaviour. And we recognise that other people have different views from our own. However, when we come into conflict with those other views, we find it very stressful. And we start to look for, well, who's got the right answer? Okay? We start to look for someone to make a decision because being in a state of ambiguous difference over what should happen is distressing to us. And he's saying this is not enough for leadership. We need to move beyond this leadership. So, as I mentioned before, leadership is practice that will bring us into conflict, bring us into tension with others. So at the next level, and at the very least, this is where Keegan would say you want to try and work towards for leadership work, is where we understand to a really good level of depth and clarity what it is that makes us tick We understand how to manage, if you like, our urges to control our behaviour. So rather than flying off the handle or being irritated or stressed when things go wrong, we actually know how to hold ourselves through those moments and to keep going. We can now see that there are a variety of different ways of thinking and a range of different social systems, and we feel the capacity to try and work with those differences in a more respectful manner. Okay? So we now understand there are different worldviews, and we can try and work through those and still reach decision. Okay? So as you can see, this is a much higher level of capacity to deal with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity than level 3. Right? So for people interested in leadership, building our tolerance through working on these kinds of ways of thinking and ways of managing ourselves, ways of managing our interactions with others is much more productive. But of course, as with all good levels, all good models, there's one more. And this is sort of the ultimate that Keegan is really encouraging all of us to aspire to. In this way of thinking, we understand ourselves as multiple. Okay? So we recognise in some sense there isn't just one me. There's the me that I am in different moods, in different modes, in different environments, and that somehow there is value in all of that. But it's not just an isolated me in a sense. It's a self that understands and has a sense of really deep connection with others simply through our shared human experience. Right? And because of that capacity to always be mindful of those connections, mindful that people are different, then issues of paradox and complexity and ambiguity are conditions in which we feel quite at ease. This is simply situation normal. Of course there are different views. It doesn't mean that we've got bad politics going on in the organisation. It doesn't mean we've got a dysfunctional relationship. Just people are different. So let's work with that. Okay? Let's see if I can step into that other way of thinking, and how does that shift my own? How does that bring new perspectives to bear? Right? So as you can see, this is a much broader lens again, even from level 4. And in some sense, it's a capacity to understand oneself in connection with others, but also to be able to step outside oneself, to see that bigger picture, okay? To recognise that our own truths are not absolute. They're always partial, they're always partisan. Right? And part of what comes with this mindset essentially is a capacity for compassion, not sympathy, not patronising others, but to recognise that all of us are in a process of struggle, and that the reason we are often seeing dysfunctional behaviour from others is simply where they're at in their journey towards cognitive complexity. And so how can we connect to where they're at to help them move up, in the same way that when we were little ones, our parents provided us with extensive supervision to stop us getting run over by cars, and then as we learnt to grow, they stepped back a little bit, and then they started to encourage us to take on more responsibility. So in that sense, level 5 functioning is also concerned always with other people's development. Okay? And what Keegan is saying is if we can move ourselves towards this, what we will find ourselves being able to do is to be mindful of the big picture, to not get caught in the minutiae of, gosh, somebody just disagreed with me. That we will be able to have a sense of emotional connection and clarity about what are the emotions and feelings and values at stake here, but also still be able to think rationally and clearly about that. And so, again, if we go back to Grint's idea about persuading others to take responsibility, I hope you can see how powerful bringing ourselves toward a level 5 mode can be in trying to engage in that persuasion in a way that others don't feel that they're just being manipulated, but actually is able to speak to and connect with their needs, and allows us together to work on things. So, are there any questions about these ideas?
Nothing at the moment, thanks, Sue.
Okay, cool. All right. So, question, how do we then foster our growth towards greater levels of cognitive complexity? Because it's obviously not simply a matter of reading a book. So these ideas here on this diagram helps us understand what's called reflective practice. Sometimes it's called double loop learning. So often the way we learn is we get a set of results, something happens, and we go, that wasn't ideal, that wasn't quite what I wanted to achieve. And so where our mind often goes at that point is we go, well, okay, what were the strategies or techniques or methods or practices that I used? Where did I make the mistake? And how do I do it better next time? That's how most of us tend to engage in reflection. And it's not that it's bad, but it is fundamentally limited. And the reason being is that what sits behind or underneath those practices and strategies and behaviours that we engage in essentially are a set of assumptions and mental models, which is what's really driving our behaviour. Okay? And that's really what we need to interrogate. Okay? However, the challenge of going there is that in order to question things that we believe in, we are likely to trigger within ourselves a defensive response. Okay? Because we are committed to our assumptions, because we are committed to our mental models, because these are the things that we use to guide our way of making sense of the world, to guide our sense of who we are in the world, when we start questioning them, it's very uncomfortable. When others start questioning them, it's very uncomfortable. And so reflective practice is helping us to understand, actually be aware that that sign of that feeling of being defensive is actually an important clue that you are onto something potentially important. And try to sit with that, try to ride it out until you can get to, I've been making this assumption all along, and you know what? Maybe it's not the best one. Maybe this is why I keep repeating this pattern of behaviour. Maybe this is why that kind of personality is the one I always get into trouble with, or maybe that's why I keep missing out on those opportunities that other people seem to be getting. Maybe I need to let go of this assumption and replace it with something more helpful. Okay? So reflective practice essentially is, if you like, the engine that can drive your growth in terms of cognitive complexity. And cognitive complexity is the underlying skill that can allow you to engage in the enabling leadership, to enable organisational change, and the kind of persuading others to take responsibility. So that's how these ideas sort of connect together. So getting really practical, though, what are some things that can help with your reflective practice? So one thing that's really helpful is to get feedback, particularly from people that know you well, people that you can trust to give you an honest opinion. Okay? And when we're doing that, really what we need to try and figure out is not only our strengths, which is what people most will want to tell us about, because we know that they know we're not going to get defensive if they say, oh, you're really good at this. Okay? But trying to figure out what is it that we're not very good at, that other people know we're not very good at, but we don't know ourselves. So trying to figure out our blind spots is very, very helpful thing that feedback can assist us with. And also, what is it that other people see us repeatedly doing that's holding us back or getting us into trouble? So feedback from those who know us well and whose intention we trust is very important to help help us figure out what might be those underlying assumptions, what might be those mental models that are programming us to behave in a certain way. Using psychometrics or other forms of personality profiling can be another way to trigger new insights into what makes us tick. Journaling is also another very good practice to start to try to understand what are the patterns of our behaviour that we keep repeating. And this doesn't need to be take a lot of time. Generally, if I'm working with somebody in a coaching environment, I'll say 5 minutes every day, write down 3 things you think went well today, that you feel confident you did well, and what was 3 things that you found challenging. Okay? And then just jot it down and then park it. And then after a couple of months, we start looking, okay, what's the pattern? What's the pattern here? What are the recurring issues that are causing you a sense of challenge? How can we cluster that up into a theme and try to get to some sense of what's underlying it? So journaling is another useful practice. Generally speaking, whatever level we're at in terms of Keegan's cognitive complexity, we're not going to suddenly leap to level 5. It's the work of a lifetime, probably, to get to level 5. But what we can do is focus on the small changes. So picking 2 or 3 things that we want to work on, set some goals about how we're going to improve. Could be something like, I need to be more patient in meetings. Okay? I need to be more patient when other people are off focus or rabbiting on about their favourite issue that doesn't interest me. Okay? Set some goals around that. How will you know if you're being more patient, and then track your progress over a 3 to 6 months period. Okay? And all the time, as you're tracking along, what you'll be doing is experimenting and making small changes in your thinking, small changes in your behaviour, ideally in lower risk contexts, to try and build confidence, because we don't really want to throw ourselves in at the deep end on everything that we want to work on. It's better to try and do it in small steps where the stakes aren't too high. Okay? And if we're thinking about reflective practice, in some sense, if we're not feeling uncomfortable, then probably your defence mechanisms are in full control. Okay? So in that sense, not growing. So behaving in ways that feel odd to us is a good indicator that you are trying to learn something new. You're trying to replace a habituated mode of operating with something that's new and different, and therefore offers you new possibilities. And of course, we don't expect to get it right the first time, the second time, even the third time. These things take practice. However, having worked with a number of people over the years who've used double loop learning, use reflective practice as their core process for leadership development, it really can generate transformational insights and transformational change for people if you stick at it, if you have the tenacity and the willingness to make yourself feel uncomfortable, to go into spaces that you don't really want to go into, but in so doing learn something new that gives you a greater capacity to deal with the kinds of challenges that leadership involves. So overall, sort of summing up, looking at these ideas generally, what are the kind of key implications for practice? So firstly, going back to GRINT, so the leadership, command, management, but also professionalism, to understand the value of those different modes of action and when they're most useful, and to build your tolerance to switch gears between them as the situation warrants. Right? It's very easy to slip into a preferred way of dealing with the world, but that kind of inflexibility is essentially antithetical to what we need to enable leadership to really emerge. So in that sense, leadership, think more about what are the powerful questions that you can ask others. What are the powerful questions that get us to work on the real things that challenge us, rather than staying in a state of blissful ignorance or willful ignorance about what's really going on and what we should actually be doing about it. Growing your cognitive complexity, growing your tolerance for all the things that come with our VUCA world is really the route to building leadership capacity. But recognise that that may bring you into a state of conflict with your professional identity. Okay? Professional identity is all about knowing more, being the expert. Leadership takes us out of a space of expertise into a space of curiosity, into a space of not knowing, into a space of being open to possibilities that aren't currently fully obvious. So that will create potentially a sense of tension if you want to move aside when people are expecting you to provide professional answers. So again, knowing those different modes, knowing when actually it's helpful to signal, okay, I know we could come up with the answers here, guys, but I actually think it's going to be more useful if we start to explore some of the questions that we're not currently addressing, and that will create new possibilities. Remembering that leadership is not really about the leader, it's about the relationship. Okay? Relationships rely on trust, they rely on respect. And so connecting with those that you seek to offer leadership to becomes the key. But as part of that, being alert to the tendency that if you do appear to be capable, others will want to put you in a pedestal. They will want to turn you into their hero. And there's a need to try to resist that, however tempting it may seem. Okay? Because we've all heard of the idea of from hero to zero, and this is the kind of dynamic that actually gets unleashed, is when we think somebody knows all the answers, when we think that they are our icon for how everyone in the world should aspire to, and then we find out that actually they didn't know that answer, or they've got some flaws in their character, as inevitably we all do. The urge at that point to dump on that person is very strong in people. So if we can resist their desire to be dependent on us in the first place, we avoid risking disappointment, but we also avoid setting ourselves up for an almighty fall when they find out actually the emperor isn't fully clothed. And then finally, reflective practice is the route into the kind of developmental work that is involved in trying to get engaged in leadership work of this nature. It requires persistence. It's not easy, it's not comfortable, but it does potentially have enormous impacts over a period of time. You know, having worked with people over a number of years now, it stuns me the kind of transformation that people can bring about within themselves through doing that kind of hard work, and the way that then empowers them to really make a powerful leadership contribution is it's wonderful to see. So we've got time now, hopefully, for discussion and questions.
Great. Well, thanks, Suze. I've got a couple here, and obviously if others have got questions you wish to submit, please send them via the chat function. The first one is, are you suggesting that decision-making in uncertain, volatile times requires the combined mental capacity of the whole group rather than just that of the leader?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, because none of us can know everything, and because we're dealing with problems that aren't amenable to clear definition or clear solution, the more, if you like, the more brains, the more perspectives we can bring into the decision-making process, the more likely we are to come up with a course of action that actually is going to make a real difference, which presumably is, that's the kind of decision that we want. So yes, a more participative, more participation in the input to the decision-making process is definitely part of it. Whether or not it actually has to be a collective decision, well, there'll be governance policies often determining whether or not that's possible. But certainly seeking advice from a wide range of different viewpoints before formulating a decision is really valuable.
Okay, thank you. And the other question is, what is the origin of VUCA?
Of what, sorry?
Of VUCA.
Oh, I think it's just one of those handy acronyms that academics came up with to try and kind of summarise the overall state of the world. So it sort of starts emerging in the literature in the early 2000s as people talk about, oh, things are changing much faster, oh, things are not as clear as they used to be. Oh, there's all these tensions that we can't seem to resolve. And so over time, you know, as the focus was on volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity as essentially like defining characteristics of our age, the acronym sort of emerged and is now kind of quite widely used in literature, basically as a shorthand for, gee, the world's quite messy these days, isn't it?
Okay, thank you. And I've got one final question here. How do you go about fostering or developing powerful questions? You mentioned earlier that
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I haven't sort of touched on this. It's kind of been implied in everything that I said, but leadership is always happening in a context, okay? And assuming that somebody is embedded in that context, then through being able to, you'll know a lot of what different people think and what the kinds of issues are. But the really powerful questions, I think, are the ones that are essentially unstated or even potentially unspeakable in the current environment. For some reason, it's what we're all avoiding. But if we were to be really honest, this is actually what's on our mind. If we were to read between the lines, this is really what's going on here. So the really powerful questions are ones essentially that are, I think, reflecting back to the group, are we avoiding talking about X, or have we missed an opportunity to think about this by bringing in this perspective? So it's trying to not, in that sense, put people on the spot, but try to open up the conversation to explore either different things or explore things in a different way than has been happening to date. And yeah, often that's reading between the lines, or it's thinking about what's unstated but is nonetheless present in the environment and not being openly dealt with. Those would be two suggestions.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And I think that's all the questions we've got. Thank you very much, Suze, for today. That's been really insightful and I've really enjoyed it. I hope everybody else has as well. Thank you to those of you that have participated, and just to reiterate, you'll all be supplied with access to the recording plus the slides and a record of your attendance after the event. And finally, a survey will pop up at the end. If you could please complete it to help us improve, that would be brilliant. And thank you once again. Good afternoon and goodbye.